Good afternoon, everyone, and hello to our live stream and YouTube audience. My name is Kimberly Begg. I am the president of the Claire Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women. We are an all-women organization that specializes in educating and mentoring young women. Our goal is to help empower young women to live happier, freer lives and contribute to a stronger, freer America. Our work has perhaps never been as important as it is now. It seems like every day brings a new news story about women's abandonment of traditional values and their shift to the left. Just this week, the New York Times reported the results of yet another study showing that Gen Z women are less religious, less interested in having children, and more in favor of abortion than Gen Z men. Of course, this makes sense. From a young age, girls consume a steady stream of content in school and on social media, conflating womanhood with wokeism and the rejection of traditional values, especially relating to marriage and motherhood. As a result, today's women face enormous pressure to conform to a leftist worldview that is not only atheistic, anti-American, and anti-male, but also blatantly anti-women. A few months ago, we surveyed 800 18 to 24-year-old women from across the country. We found that despite modern influences, today's young women still hold naturally conservative beliefs, but they often hide them to avoid conflict. That last part is important. It may explain the steady leftward shift of women as a group. You see, women are equal in dignity to men, but we are not the same. Did you know that studies show that women rely on friendships for support more than men? And that we are more likely to conform to the ideas and behaviors of a group than men? Here at the Luce Center, our programs are designed to provide specialized help to women. Look around you in this room and you will understand what I mean. Today's audience is a mix of women of all ages, but our core programs serve young women in college and high school. We bring young women together in a spirit of friendship. We give them strong, virtuous role models like today's speaker, who are truth seekers and truth tellers. We nurture their naturally conservative beliefs, thus empowering them to live better lives and contribute positively to their families, churches, workplaces, and communities. Our approach works because it is rooted in truths about virtue, womanhood, and the human experience, topics our distinguished speaker has written extensively about. I am so pleased that she is here with us today, and I am honored to introduce you to her now. Erika Bachiochi is a legal scholar specializing in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, and sexual ethics. She is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. She is also the founder of a classical school in Massachusetts. And she is the author of The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision, which offers an original look at the development of feminism in the United States, advancing a vision of rights that rests upon our responsibilities to others. I highly recommend this book. In fact, it is probably the book that I recommend to young women more than any other. And I think once you hear from Erika today, you will understand why. Please join me in welcoming Erika Bachiochi.
Oh, great, sorry. That was a really wonderful, generous introduction. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be with you all today, especially in a group of women, as I want to discuss with you what I take to be a really crucial task of our time, as I think Kimberly enunciated why, and that is the education of girls and the formation of women. So these themes kind of spring forth from my recent book, though they are not fully fleshed out there. So I want to do that with you today. So, as I assume a room full of conservatives well know, our country's founders viewed the Republican regime they crafted as one that depended upon the virtue of its citizens. So, though they well appreciated that human fallibility and our propensity for vice, and so institutionalized, of course, layers of checks and balances, they also knew that political self government required personal self government. A vicious people, a people enslaved by their own passions, would easily be made the slaves of others. For the American founders knew that true freedom required virtue. And virtue was properly inculcated in families and churches, and at that time was understood to be encouraged by the law and assisted by God's grace. And the inculcation of virtue was not the work of one generation, it would be required of every generation. And so every family, every citizen, a republic, if you can keep it. Indeed, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed during his travels throughout New England in the 1830s, Americans wisely entrusted this politically indispensable task of moral formation mainly to non political institutions like the family, and in particular, he observed, to American women. Tocqueville fretted over 700 pages of Democracy in America, his book, whether individualism and materialism would undermine the new nation's liberties. He worried in particular that apathetic individualism, rampant acquisitiveness, and servile majoritarianism would threaten Republican citizens' capacity for independence of thought and for greatness of soul. But Tocqueville saw in American women a high minded communitarian counterpoise to the liberalizing and kind of flattening tendencies inherent in a liberal democracy. In Tocqueville's view, private women focused on the inculcation of virtue in their children and solidarity in their communities moderated the democratic excesses of what he named public men. As such, for him, women were the key to the whole American enterprise. As he put it, everything which has a bearing on the status of women, their habits, their thoughts, is, in my view, of great political importance. So too in our time, it seems to me. But today, our fellow Americans, except for places like this, don't seem to see the necessity of cultivating virtue in order to safeguard freedom. Nor are women as mothers, nor men as fathers, seen as being invested with a distinct kind of moral authority or responsibility for cultivating the virtues in the young. Indeed, it is fashionable on the political right today to argue that the vaunted role of women in the nascent republic as the moral guardians of their children, and so too of the nation, was largely abandoned because women obtained rights to formal, kind of co-equal education and to enter the professions on a par with men. More likely, though, in my view, is that it's just as women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were securing the civil and political rights the American founders had denied them, our nation's perspective on education began to shift dramatically. No longer was formation in the home and at school understood to be a profoundly moral and inescapably religious enterprise. Now the agenda was to train kids to build the technical and interpersonal skills needed for the increasingly global market economy. Indeed, where liberal education was not traded in altogether for the honing of new technical skills, liberal arts programs themselves were inundated by progressive educational theories and political ideologies too, even as these new educators still dared to call what they were doing liberal arts. To be sure, the opportunity to acquire technical and professional training is important. I have a law degree. I definitely think that's the case. But the seismic loss of the morally formative, really integrative, the integrating possibility and the enterprise of an authentic liberal education, the kind of education actually that the mid 19th century women's rights advocates were actually wanting for women, has negatively impacted both men and women. This decline in liberal education has impacted both men and women in potentially different ways, I think, as I'll discuss, and has made us less morally prepared for that global technical revolution that's in our midst every day. So, what happens when a regime that prizes liberty and equality abandons the business of cultivating virtue? Well, this is the crucial question, is one that the 18th century pedagogue, moralist, and advocate for the rights of women, Mary Wollstonecraft, returned to throughout her abbreviated life. So, Wollstonecraft lived and wrote in the late 18th century, just as the American and then French revolutions were throwing off old forms of hereditary rule in their respective attempts, we could say with greater or lesser success, to enact altogether new forms of republican government. Like her fellow small r Republicans, Wollstonecraft extolled freedom from illegitimate and arbitrary power, but not freedom left to unconstrained desires. For her, political freedom both depended upon and served each person's moral development, which consisted of learning how to discharge everyday duties virtuously. In her view, the trouble with the Republican vision offered by the French revolutionaries, in sharp contrast to the Americans, I might add, was that the French insisted upon liberty, equality, and fraternity without also recognizing the quote, revolution in morals, as she put it, that was needed to ground these aspirations. Now, to be sure, Wollstonecraft believed that the aristocracy and the clerics of the ancient regime that was being overthrown and the lower classes that took on their traits had been morally corrupted. Instead of focusing on character formation, in her view, they were enamored by riches, property, honors, ceremony, and outward show. As Wollstonecraft writes in her critique of Edmund Burke's stalwart reliance on tradition to defend the absolute monarchy, quote, men were content, this is Wollstonecraft, men were content to borrow their virtues from posterity rather than undertake the arduous task of acquiring virtue for themselves. Both men and women, she thought, had grown morally corrupt in different ways, and this corruption was reinforcing. As she put it, the two sexes mutually corrupt and improve one another. And so she addresses her vindication of the rights of women in 1792 to the author of a report that had called for national public education to form male citizens in the virtues of republican government. The report had relied on the educational theories like that of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Emile. Not sure if anyone has read the Emile. And so Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women is in the main an engagement and rebuke of Rousseau's theory of women's education. So as one who had not only by then written 3 books on the education of young women, but had also served as the eldest daughter of her own large family, worked as a governess for another family, and had also opened a school for girls, Wollstonecraft wished to offer her own account of the kind of education women needed for a republic to thrive, but not only for Republican citizenship, for women's own flourishing as human beings and the flourishing of their families too. And so Wollstonecraft writes early on in The Rights of Women that, quote, the mother who wishes to give true dignity of character to her daughter must proceed on a plan diametrically opposed to the one Rousseau has recommended. So I finally get to the aim of my talk, to explore Wollstonecraft's account of moral education as a prerequisite for women to live according to the noble dignity to which they were called. But to understand it fully and to see how I think it can really help us today, I want to draw out Wollstonecraft's views up and against that chief interlocutor, Rousseau. So whereas, and don't worry if you haven't read either of them, hopefully I can bring you along and then you'll want to go read them. Whereas Rousseau sought to educate men and women to be virtuous citizens for the needs of the Republican polity, duly formed by his understanding of kind of civil religion, Wollstonecraft had her eyes set on heaven, right where I think we need them to be. As Edith Stein taught, the Catholic philosopher, but from a deeply Catholic perspective, the first education for women must be religious, seeing the transcendent purpose of their lives so as to understand who they really are and in what their true dignity and nobility consists. Wollstonecraft was no Catholic and indeed struggled in her own life, and yet a transcendent vision of education is her account as well. Okay, so to dive into this, and I really think this kind of subtle debate between the two is very much worth our time. So Wollstonecraft agreed with Rousseau and the American founders that public virtue required private formation. Indeed, all small r Republicans bemoaned the moral decadence of a society captivated by wealth and prestige rather than virtue. But Wollstonecraft simultaneously refused to accept Rousseau's assumption that while men needed to cultivate Republican virtues, women could simply serve as instruments of that cultivation. In Wollstonecraft's view, Rousseau wished to see women lean into what she regarded as the vicious temptations to which he saw so many women fall prey and to which she herself was tempted: sensuality, caring too much what other people think, and the slavish desire to please men. It's not that Rousseau lacked insights about the base inclinations of both men and women. Wollstonecraft agrees with him that vanity is our tragic flaw. But while Rousseau's educational program for men attempts to guard against their vanity, his version for women does no such thing. Instead, he wishes to make use of women's vanity, to have women lean into it for the apparent good of men. Now, for those of you who don't know Rousseau's basically general theory of kind of religion, he regards Christianity as rendering men both effeminate and weak, lacking in courage and public spirit. And he also believes that Christianity makes women austere in their virtue rather than properly sensual. So, according to Wollstonecraft's reading, Rousseau wants women to lean into their slavish desires to please men for the sake of men, or really for the sake of channeling men's passions into manly service of the state. For he seems to think that if men only serve the family, he seems to think that men will only serve the family as good providers and defenders, as he believes they should be, if they perceive women to be comparatively weak and entirely dependent upon them. Only if men idolize women as a kind of foreign, mysterious species will men consecrate themselves to the family and the state's protection. This is his view. And because women are physically weaker and even more vulnerable when they have children, women have no alternative, in Rousseau's view, but to achieve this kind of equality in marriage through working to ensure men also depend upon them. Indeed, in Rousseau's account, women find their strength, their empire, by ruling over and disciplining men's desires through their beauty and feminine charms. Women's gentle submission is a kind of political tool by which women exert quiet control and power, compelling the father of their child to stick around and to provide, and inspiring men to heroic activity for the good of the state. Rousseau writes, quote, "Unless a man is a monster, the gentleness of a woman will bring him around and triumph over him sooner or later." One hastens to add, well, what if the man is a monster? But I'll come back to that. Now, Wollstonecraft well recognizes that there is a kind of feminine power in a young woman who reigns through submission to the opinions of men. And so Wollstonecraft takes her task to be a difficult one, not only to convince her male readers that rigorous education is crucial for women to be good wives and mothers and good citizens too, but she also has to convince women and mothers of daughters that a life of authentic virtue and true companionship with one's husband or future husband is a more noble ambition, and one on which their happiness and the true good of the family and of society depends. After all, she explains in various ways in her books, that there are many risks to women who forego their own moral development and focus on their particularly feminine charms. First, women who have been trained up from their youth to focus on their beauty and kind of only finding a good match in order to win kind of husband, or you could imagine like OnlyFans online or something like that, are vulnerable to being abandoned by him for a younger woman as their beauty wanes. Or second reason she gives is being left a widow with no substantial moral resources to depend upon because they were so focused on becoming pleasing to men. Or third, she says that women taught to reign by their beauty and charms may be tempted by the attention they receive from other men who aren't their husbands. Wollstonecraft laments, quote, "Still the real homage," praise, right, "which women receive is intoxicating. It may be impossible to convince them that the illegitimate power which they obtain by degrading themselves into objects of men's desire is a curse. The sensual power that women obtain over men is by, she says, unjust means, because it demands that women both practice and foster vice. It's a path, in her view, that leads women to become either the abject slaves of men or capacious tyrants over them, incapable of being rather what she hopes for them, quote, more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, and more reasonable mothers. And so Wollstonecraft famously writes against Rousseau, quote, I don't wish for women to have power over men, but over themselves. And she wanted such virtuous self-mastery for men as well. So Wollstonecraft explains early on in The Rights of Women that if women are not, quote, prepared by education to become the companions of men rather than their mistresses, they will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. Why? Because they won't form good marriages upon which personal happiness and societal happiness depends. And they won't be prepared to inculcate virtue in their children, having not worked to cultivate the virtues in themselves. So Wollstonecraft challenged women preoccupied with pleasures and preening and establishing themselves socially, calling them instead to the more important work of shaping their own characters, and if they were mothers, those of their children too. When, quote, strength of body and mind are sacrificed to libertine notions of beauty, Wollstonecraft writes, women become merely alluring mistresses or alluring objects for a moment. But surely, Wollstonecraft declares, these weak beings are only fit for a I can never say this word, seraglio, which is like a harem. Can they govern a family, she asks, or take care of the poor babes whom they bring into the world? This feminine degeneracy was not only something done to women, no, it is something that she saw them as deeply complicit in too. For Wollstonecraft believed that, quote, the care of children in their infancy is one of the grand duties annexed to the female character by nature, end quote. Wollstonecraft held a high view of motherhood, and she knew that the task of molding the character of children required immense strength of body, mind, and soul. For these natural and ennobling duties of care were not so overpowering in a woman, or even in a mother, in Wollstonecraft's view, that they would necessarily triumph over corrupt social conventions that tempted women to more superficial pleasures or accomplishments. And I think we see this today. Such goodly inclinations and maternal obligations needed to be cultivated by a liberal education, demanded by appropriately weighty social expectations, and crucially, supported by paternal engagement, affection, and support. In her time, as in ours, they were not. This path, in Wollstonecraft's view, Rousseau's path, is a corruption, a degradation of what women ought to be. But whereas Rousseau and some of the American founders thought virtue, and thereby the work of inculcating it, was important because it was what the Republic needed, remember, Wollstonecraft believed it was also vital that women were able to apprehend their higher calling. Women needed to know that they, no less than man, had been called for friendship with God. It wasn't just the classical inheritance that informed Wollstonecraft's account of education, therefore. Historic Christianity was just as important a source, as it was of the conviction that women were fully human, created by and responsible to God and others, and thus also due natural rights to carry out their natural duties. Women, like men, quote, are placed on this earth to unfold their faculties, she says, to rise in excellence by the exercise of powers implanted for that purpose. Because women didn't know who they were not living as the dignified persons they were created to be. Her great complaint then in The Rights of Women, and an earlier text as well, is one that I think we can lodge in our time. A false system of education and other social norms have not prepared women, or indeed men, for their deeply noble human, social, spousal, and parental obligations. They were instead living lives more akin to animals, instead of the dignified humans they were created to be. In Thoughts on the Education of Our Daughters, her first book in 1787, when she was working as a schoolmistress of the school she founded, Wollstonecraft had written the following passage, quote, the main business of our lives is to learn to be virtuous. And he, with a capital H, who is training us for immortal bliss, knows best what trials will contribute to make it so. And our resignation and improvement will render us more respectable to ourselves and to that being, capital B, whose approbation, that is, approval, is of more value than life itself. In The Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft writes 5 years later to, quote, effect a revolution in female manners, to restore women to their, quote, lost dignity, so that they may, quote, labor by reforming themselves to reform the world. Only by placing oneself in right relationship with God will they live according to their own high dignity and come to understand how important their work is as daughters, sisters, friends, wives, and mothers. They will be strong, faithful, and benevolent women, fixated not on appearances and consumed with how to please, but rather preparing their children and themselves for eternity. Now, for those who know the work of Edith Stein, we might say that Wollstonecraft wants women to resist what Stein called the specific degeneracy of woman, which Stein similarly describes as, quote, servile dependence on man or people pleasing, caring inordinately about what others think. And this leads to, in Stein's word, a predominantly sensual animal existence. Just consider the description of the curse to women in Genesis after the fall. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This feminine degeneracy of servile dependency is a result of the fall. It is not good for women's souls, which I'll get to in a minute. But even before that, this degeneracy is also particularly dangerous to women in light of what Stein and Wollstonecraft, too, regard as the correlative degeneracy of man. What Stein says is brutal despotism over other creatures, especially women. But it's not only dangerous for a woman to be utterly dependent upon man, who is or may become a monster. The specific danger for women, according to Stein, is that, quote, I'm going to read this really slowly because it's tricky. Instead, this is Stein first, instead of spiritualizing the body, the soul in this woman is controlled by it, and the body loses accordingly its character as a human body with noble aspirations, right? Wollstonecraft sings the same tune, quote, taught from infancy that beauty is a woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body and seeks only to adorn its prison. For those who kind of know their ancient or Christian anthropology, the proper ordering of the person is reason and then the will and then the passions, right? Reason is to govern the passions in both men and women. So whereas Rousseau wished for women to lean into and make use of this kind of sensual animal existence, both Wollstonecraft and Stein want by liberal education and moral formation to protect women from the characteristic vices to which they are tempted in order to call them to something greater. And Stein and Wollstonecraft both observed each sex can be liberated from its own degenerate tendencies by cultivating in themselves all of the virtues, especially those more naturally acquired by the opposite sex. As fully integrated persons, then, virtuous men can attend with tender strength to the needs of the vulnerable. Virtuous women can attend with courageous care to that which is objective and true. Rigorous liberal education works to achieve this liberating integration of mind, heart, and body, a liberation from self for the sake of God and others. According to both Stein and Wollstonecraft, then, a proper education for women is not only rigorously intellectual, it's also religious and moral. It's what was once called liberal for a long time, and increasingly it's called classical. Wollstonecraft is convinced that we can't expect women to rise to the occasion of discharging their noble duties happily unless they understand why they ought to be virtuous. They need the bigger picture. That is, education is not merely preparation for life, as many contemporary educators tend to see it, but as she writes, quote, the first step to form a being advancing gradually toward perfection. A woman must then be given the kind of education that will, as Wollstonecraft writes in the preface to The Rights of Women, quote, strengthen her reason till she comprehend her duty and see in what manner it is connected with her real good. And we know from her early texts on education that she believed that education is a process which involves the schooling of the desire and the nurturing of the natural inclinations, all to the end of flourishing both now and eternally. Such a schooling and such a nurturing occurs by way of imitation and habituation, she thought. And all this relies on the prior recognition that refining your reason is synonymous with aligning your will to that of the divine author of reason, God. Reason is the gift God has given us to reflect his goodness and wisdom. Reason is, in Wollstonecraft's words, quote, an emanation of divinity, the tie that connects creature with the creator. Thus, contemplation of God's goodness and wisdom is not only possible, according to Wollstonecraft, there's also something natural about it. Other creatures, she writes in one of those early books, the original stories from real life, other creatures, she says, only think of supporting themselves. A human being, however, is allowed to ennoble his nature, cultivating his mind and enlarging his heart. For Wollstonecraft, we're both dependent, rational animals and responsible agents, and there's a balance to be attained. On the one hand, quote, we are all dependent on each other, she writes, and this dependence is wisely ordered by our Heavenly Father to call forth many virtues, to exercise the best affections of the human heart and fix them into habits, end quote. On the other hand, we're also, quote, created accountable creatures who must run the race ourselves and by our own exertions acquire virtue. The utmost our friends can do is point out the right road and clear away some of the loose rubbish, which might at first retard our progress, end quote. Given a woman's infinite worth, she must not be educated like a, quote, fanciful kind of half being, she said, focused on external adornments, accomplishments, or just charm. No, a woman must, quote, endeavor to acquire the human virtues or perfections, she says, of her nature. But perfecting our nature is an arduous task. We indeed need guidance from fathers and mothers, from our teachers. So, in imitating exemplars from an early age, and I think I cut this part, so I'm just going to tell you, one of her early books was called The Female Reader, and in it she collects works from the Bible, Shakespeare, Milton, etc., where she just wants to sort of allow women, and she kind of has her own sort of commentary in there as well. So some of these quotes, I think I cut some of them, but are coming from there. So, in imitating these exemplars from an early age in books and our parents and our teachers, Wollstonecraft thought we develop the moral virtues that perfect our relations with God and others, being crafted and crafting ourselves in turn. Schooling the moral imagination through imitation was key to acquiring virtue for Wollstonecraft, but so was making virtue our own. And it's in this making virtue our own that afforded women independence, the capacity of carrying out their duties of care to others freely. The virtuous woman is independent and free because she's habituated in doing good and loving the good. Though it sounds alien to us, Wollstonecraft is unwavering in her belief that, quote, the being who discharges the duties of its station is independent. The being who discharges the duties of its station is independent. Because of Wollstonecraft's passionate late 18th century advocacy for the rights of women, she's often hailed as the first feminist or proto-feminist, yet her account of independence as the, quote, grand blessing of life, the basis of every virtue, in fact, inverts modern feminism's promotion of independence as individual autonomy, increasingly defined as freedom from all given bodily and moral constraints. Early on in The Rights of Woman, Wollstonecraft describes a woman who has walked the road of character. She is married, but the man she has married has died. As a mom of many children, I especially really love how Wollstonecraft here imagines this widow who has lost a husband that she really loved. She writes, quote, I think I see her surrounded by her children, reaping the reward of her care. She sees the virtues which she has endeavored to plan on principles fixed into habits, to see her children attain a strength of character sufficient to enable them to endure adversity without forgetting their mother's example. The task of life thus fulfilled, she calmly waits for the sleep of death, and rising from the grave may say, behold, thou gave me a talent, and here are 5 talents. Wollstonecraft's view of independence, of doing what I ought to do freely and happily because it coheres with my real good, is perhaps what Tocqueville saw in American women, who freely dedicated themselves to the moral formation of their children and the flourishing of their communities. As the corpus of Wollstonecraft's work shows, high moral purpose in service of one's family and the common good is perfectly consistent with, and indeed may well be, the highest end of the political and legal rights of women and of men too. Imagine a republic so constituted. And before I end, I just want to add one last thing, which is to read a private prayer in the female reader Wollstonecraft wrote herself. She penned 4 private prayers. And I'm reading a very small part of one of them, and then we can go to Q&A. She says, "Thou knowest whereof I am made, and rememberest thou I am but dust. Self-convicted, I prostrate myself before thy throne of grace, and seek not to hide or palliate my faults. Be not extreme to mark what I have done amiss. Still allow me to call thee Father, and rejoice in my existence, since I can trace thy goodness and truth on earth, and feel myself allied to that glorious being who breathed into me the breath of life, and gave me a capacity to know and to serve him." Thank you. Sorry, but when the women's studies departments came to be in the 1970s, they read back their priors back into the first wave of the women's movement. So all we hear are about people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a radical of that movement and was actually thrown out of it after she tried to rewrite the Bible. But there are all these other women who in this heritage piece I'm helping people see. So Sarah Grimke, who Quaker woman, and these are Quakers, deeply Bible-believing Quaker women. Lucretia Mott, who wrote a book called, or a speech called "The Discourse on Women." And all these women were, and I'm showing how they were deeply influenced by Wollstonecraft's thought. They were readers of Vindication of the Rights of Women. They tried to kind of bring back her reputation after her late husband had soiled it in his biography. And so in that frame, there's an idea of rights as necessary to carry out responsibilities. And so they're as Mott puts it somewhere, like, we don't want to change woman's nature. We're actually quite happy with woman's nature. Thank you very much. But we want sort of to be appreciated and respected, and not just sort of thought of as like the toys of men. It's very similar kind of to how Wollstonecraft talks about these kind of alluring mistresses. Like, we want to be taken seriously and be given sort of the moral formation through education, all that. And so there's an understanding of what I call sexual asymmetry, which is that, there are not only the differences between the men and women, as I usually say, that men and women can both engage in the same sexual act, but it is women and not men who end up pregnant. So that type of reproductive asymmetry, but then obvious asymmetries like the strength of men versus women, and then the different kinds of asymmetries that you can see in terms of like psychological things. And so what they were trying to do is like uplift those kind of female attributes, the strength of women, not these degeneracies, but the real strengths of women. And so what they wanted to deal with these asymmetries is they did want laws protective of women. And as the industrialization had kind of, there's a whole long story here, but had, changed the way in which the household was where the real productive work of women that women were doing. A lot of that work was taken out of the home. And so women were suddenly like left to either manage them, find jobs themselves or supplement their husband's income or deal with men who had been like attracted by the city's bars and brothels. And how are they going to deal with that when, the father at that point was the custodian of their children, and they had to, in order to escape abuse, they had to like, leave their children. So they were dealing with those. They wanted those kinds of laws to be put, and they wanted full education, as I talked about, a full liberal education. But what they were looking for was, they were also calling upon, they were pointing at the sexual double standard as a real problem for why women were ending up. They were talking a lot about abortion. All of them had actually very fervently pro-life things to say, which you can see in a lot of my work in the footnotes of this book. But then also you'll see in this actually great new book called Pity for Evil, which is about all of these 19th century women. It's out from Encounter Books, about the earliest female doctors and their views about abortion, really trying to uplift women to take those duties of care, both to their born children and the unborn children, very, very seriously, and how to help them do that. So they're looking for, in response to these asymmetries, which they took very seriously, and they respected these asymmetries between these differences between men and women, they wanted moral. So they called men to chastity, as Christianity has always done, but they called men to chastity. So votes for women, chastity for men was like one of the slogans. Chastity for men, they wanted that kind of moral and moral education and all that, legal and political changes, right? So what happens then, as you move on, is in the 1920s, Margaret Sanger comes to pass, and she and her thought and the way in which she lays the groundwork for the thought of the next wave of feminism, though there's a great disjoint between these two, is to use technology to deal with these asymmetries. So instead of like having men become better men and women become better women and all of that, she wants technology to come in and deal with the fact that men won't be chaste. And so she introduces the pill, or because women were having so many children and again, in making it difficult to care for them and all that. So the pill then, and then abortion comes right on its heels. The pill is, she then goes to have it manufactured and Sanger, and then it's, as soon as it's on the market, and even before then, and approved by the FDA, American women are like gobbling it up. And then abortion comes to pass because there's this idea by Sanger, who was, against abortion, that, if we can, kind of deal with these things beforehand, we won't. It's like a preventative to abortion, a prophylactic against abortion. But instead, it kind of opens up this whole idea that, now we can take risks in sex that we didn't before. And so it ramps up sexual risk taking inside marriage, but much more outside of marriage. And so then you have all of a sudden the need for abortion to deal with the fact that, people aren't taking seriously their responsibilities around sex. And so then, I can keep telling the story, but once the pill, and actually my friend Abigail Favali, whose book Genesis of Gender and just her work generally is really good on this, showing about how when you take away the reproductive aspect of sex, through the pill and through kind of separating sex and reproduction, then not only, do you kind of allow for the risk taking, which is what more of my work has talked about, you also sort of give way to this idea, and we see this in Humanae Vitae, and of the idea of kind of sex as, recreational. And then you start to, when you don't think of men and women as, what Aristotle understood is that women reproduce inside themselves, men reproduce outside of themselves. Like that's the basic difference, is this reproductive difference, the capacity for pregnancy and then the capacity for fatherhood and motherhood and fatherhood. When you don't see those as like knit into who men and women are, because you've just said, you can have sex without the possibility of having to care for children, or you can now reproduce like in all sorts of with reproductive technologies, then you've kind of forgotten entirely like what the differences between men and women are. And so then you can just sort of start to perform men, like what a man is and what a woman is. And what do those performances look like? A lot like what Wollstonecraft and Edith Stein and all those, women were basically, and Lucretia Mott were saying was the degenerate form of women, right? Is like, let's put on lots of makeup and wear I'm not saying makeup and high heels. I wear makeup and high heels. But you know what I mean? Like those are glosses on womanhood. They're not the core of womanhood, right? It's wonderful to care about beauty and gentleness and all these things, but that's a gloss of that's not virtue itself, right? That's not womanhood itself. And so, but then we have this, like when we don't know what a woman is, we don't know of this beautiful capacity for motherhood and the beauty of motherhood. And then we just are left with kind of these like superficials, which is exactly what those early women's advocates were railing against. Sorry, that was a long story, but there you go.
I was just wondering if you had been able to engage people who are very well-meaning with their ideologies, contrary to what you described. If if you've encountered ways that you've been able to enter in without dealing with mental gymnastics and word salad, that is just, kind of ludicrous. But really been able to ground it in virtue, which, like you said, I feel like we don't experience a society that holds up virtue as the end all be all anymore. It's more of what you were saying, the degenerate kind of base aspects of male and female. So I was just kind of wondering if you'd been able to, because I experience a lot of people who I would love to enter in a conversation, but it just, I feel like I have no framework because there's really no basis for the value of virtue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. So I actually do. So a lot of my work is engaging with those with whom I disagree, especially on the abortion question. So my law review articles, for instance, before I wrote this book, but that are kind of captured in chapter 8 of the book, they're all engaging. Kind of when Kimberly mentioned that I was an expert in feminist legal theory, it's like literally when I had my kids, I would print out law review articles and push my kids in the swing and like read feminist legal theory. So I kind of, and I mean, the important point, I think, is that I had been a Marxist feminist in college and had a big conversion. So I have always felt myself called to sort of build a bridge back to the woman I was in some sense, because, some people aren't lucky enough to have a full-blown religious conversion. So I do that a lot. And I guess one place I would tell you just to go and like witness it is, so one of kind of the hottest podcasts by the New York Times, fellow named Ezra Klein. So he's a like kind of leading progressive intellectual, very smart guy, had me on to talk about women's rights from the right. And so you can just go look up Ezra Klein. And I think from what I gather, I had him on his heels a bit. And I guess the short way of telling you what I do is that I do think, I'm a big believer, and I think Wollstonecraft was also, though she never uses the term, and I never used the term in this book either, but as I've been writing more about it and sort of the legal literature, I do, which is I'm a big believer in just the fact of natural law. And so I think the way, instead of using the term natural law, which I just talk a lot about responsibilities and duties of care. And duties of care is a term of art in law, especially around like tort law and all of that. So duties of care works really well as a way to say, like, we tend to really believe we have responsibilities to one another. I mean, this is very much true on the left. If you think about like pet causes of theirs, it's about responsibilities to other human beings, right? So, and to nature and things like that. But so I always try to start with duties of care. So I never use the language of natural law. So even tonight, I'm speaking with the president at Catholic University. He's having a conversation with me. And in my introductory remarks, I talk all about what natural law is, but I never say natural law. So what natural law is it's the fact that our reason obligates us. There's something within us that is obligating us to avoid evil and to do good. And so it's like trying to get at that part, like trying to pull out like the good that they want to do and the evil that they want to avoid, and starting somewhere that you kind of both agree on the duties of care. Parenting is a very obvious one because there's pretty much, except for if you're like a psychopath, people don't think you don't owe responsibilities to your born children, the ones that are under your care, right? And so Ezra is great because he loves being a father. And so it's a great place to start is with duties of care that mothers and fathers owe their children. Maybe you don't even say mothers and fathers because that already gets you but so that parents owe their children. So the other thing I would say is with regard to virtue, don't say the word virtue or even virtues, name the virtues. So everybody, people don't like, impatient, impetuous, like evil, but they love patience, justice. I mean, claims for justice, right? Or all over. So like name, maybe don't say temperance, but you could say moderation, although that's not a great one for our society right now, is it? But like with food, it is. Right? So it's like trying to find ways, and bring this to your prayer, I think, is like trying to find ways where you can connect at that place because they're a human being. And we're both fallen, and we're kind of on different, and there may be ways in which you can learn from them too, right? Because so I think it's like just being really human and trying to connect and I think building bridges. Like it's funny how in our politics today, it's kind of like we just want to think that like we can just hammer someone and then it's all over. I've won the argument and there. And it's like, you do know that we're trying to we have to, in order to bring our country back around in some way, like we have to kind of work together and build community, right? And so how do we do that? I think is really important is I think one thing that I learned a lot, I got into AA when I was 17, is just the way in which we can really have a lot of pity for those who are like kind of acting out of their hurt, which I think is a lot of cases. And it's not so much, I think one of those mistakes sometimes conservatives make is to name the hurt. Like, look, that person's hurt and they're acting out of the hurt. It's like, why? No, just go and care for that, take care and be the person they need. And then, and not in an instrumental way to really build friendships. And I just think that's it's always been the case in our republic is working one-on-one with people. And I think it's really important, and that women especially have a real facility there. Because, anyway, so that's, I guess I would say, go watch the Ezra Klein. And thank you for the ride, by the way. She helped me get here. I wouldn't be here right now. Yes. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I should let you bring the.
Recently, I was at a talk by Dr. Monica Ashour. I don't know if you know who she is. She does a lot of research and evangelization on the gender question.
Mm.
And one of the issues she says that she faces is that we live now in an environment of sentimentality
Mm.
rather than reason.
Mm.
So could you help us to kind of, take that and help us to engage the argument when we know we're really talking to a
Yeah.
generation of sentimentality?
Yeah. So this is actually funny because I would say that's exactly the thing that Wollstonecraft, Mott, Grimke, I mean, all of them were talking about. It's kind of this way in which if we don't have liberal education really like challenging our intellects, especially women will how does Stein puts it, actually there's so many different, in this heritage piece you'll read all sorts of women talking about this, that like when we don't exercise our reason, that sort of capacity in our heart becomes overblown, and so we can only like do things with our heart, right? And so like that's great, hearts are great, I love like beautiful hearts, that's awesome, but they have to be like rightly ordered in the person. And so reason and principle, truth has to govern, right? And so that's a real issue you see is with regard to what's happening on the trans issue, because girls, and you see this in girls' schools, there's like a compassion for the person, and that it's harder to divide. Like it's harder to, where boys, like I have 4 girls and 3 boys. So I see this, like the capacity for very mature women can sort of see the person as a whole and then understand like the hurt that's animating that. But I think when you don't have that like maturity through really rigorous exercise of your reason, then it can be like, I only see the person and the harm and I don't sort of see what the problem is. So it's like it's very much sentimentality. And that's, so read Mary Wollstonecraft, read Lucretia Mott, like read these women who totally got this, because this was the problem in their time, was like women weren't fully educated. And so they were sort of left to be these, and not to say like all women were like that. There were, of course, like very strong women of faith, especially who enabled, like they were thinking with the churches and all that, and they were very, very strong. But there was this problem with sentimentality. So I think that's right. I think we have to have a good account of reason. So a lot of times we kind of think that like reason is just a bunch of facts and logic and all that. And I think it's really important to understand reason as a participation in kind of the logos of God, like that there is something that's, and that's why prayer is an important aspect of like the light of faith, reason as the light. It's important. So I think like, how do you engage with just like a sentimental person in front of you? Well, try in the education of, I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk in particular, because this is where you see Rousseau really coming in and saying, yes, we want that sentimentality of women. But now that we have a whole culture that's like led by sentimental women, I don't know that he would agree with that now. Well, he also wanted to keep women in their houses. So like sentimental women belong in their houses, not out in the world. So yeah, I mean, it is a real trick. It's hard because a lot of times you'll be talking with someone, you're trying to give reasons, say for abortion, which is like the most obvious one, and they'll say, "Well, I just feel that blah 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 blah," and you're kind of like, "What do I do now?" Yeah. So I'm not answering this question very well. Yeah, I mean, I guess I could say is like, I'm involved in a girls' school. I'm on the board of a girls' school. And I think like really, I mean, reading Morita Stein on the education of women, I think is really helpful because she also was getting at that. I mean, she's talking about that specific degeneracy. And what's fascinating about Stein is that she says, very much contrary to Rousseau, she says, how do you get women out of this? And she says it's through objective work. And the reason it's objective work is that what objective work does, now that could be study, it could be housework, it could be whatever, but it is putting an objective ordering of the universe. So like caring for children, but we're thinking mainly right now of study, right? It's putting like an objective things before the woman and having her be fully engaged in something that's objective outside of herself. So she can engage that, but she's not like fully, so you'll hear, especially with like younger girls, well, that's nice that you've just told me all those things, but I don't feel like that's true. And it's like, well, hold on, you've got to first like be under that text. You have to allow that text. We're going to study the text and what the text said. Sorry, but we don't really care about your feelings right now. And that's like liberal education, right? And so I think like that rigor is what she saw was important for women, which I think is really helpful right now. Is it's not like, oh, good, your heart is no. We want hearts to be purified and brought, engaged like with truth. And that truth is not like a bludgeon, right? It's something that helps form me like through my prudence, through experience and all that. And that is the work of liberal education. And so like I'm very grateful to be involved in a classical school, which is now like I mean, we now have like 300 students when we started it with like 25 about 12 years ago. But it's like that doing that at a very young age, of course, makes it much better. Oh, sorry. So long-winded.
Erika, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a tradition here at the Clare Booth Luce Center for Conservative Women of giving you a beautiful Yeti mug. It is our Clare Booth Luce mug with one of our favorite quotes, which you especially will appreciate. You want to read this?
Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount. Yes, courage. Good. That's
There
also
you go.
what women need. Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Erika. And I hope that you will all join us for lunch, which is right in the boardroom out here in the hallway. Thank you so much for joining us.